uh, when there was a transition from small stores to larger and larger stores. And this all happened right in the middle actually of the Depression, where grocery stores were becoming competitive one with another. And then they just built larger and larger stores with more and more of a variety of the things that you could buy. For instance, when we would go to stores when I was, say, 9 or 10 or 11 years old, you could get bread, you could get most of the dairy products, but you couldn't get anything frozen because they didn't have the type of refrigeration and that sort of thing that they needed to keep frozen foods around. If you wanted to get ice cream or popsicles or that sort of thing, you had to go to a special store that had it. Perhaps a store where they made milkshakes and served soda pop and that sort of thing. So that the first really big grocery store that I had gone into was probably about 6 blocks from my house. But it was obvious at that time that with the competition one store had with another, the prices on many things would be lower. And even at a young age, I recognized that this was interesting to kind of keep track of what the cost of vegetables and bread, rolls, canned goods, especially canned goods, how this would be. There was another thing when you went into a grocery store, and I remember the first or second Acme that was ever built in Akron. You would go into the store and go up to a counter, and they would have, say, 3 clerks working in the store. The store was not all that big, so one of the clerks would come up to you and say, "May I help you?" And then you said yes, and you had a list of groceries, and you would present them with the list if you were a youngster, and then they would fill out the list. And they would go through the store and pick out the things that you had on your list and bring them back to the counter. They may take several trips around the store before they found everything that you wanted. And on some of these items, the store was not, of course, built such that the shelves were very, very tall. They'd go almost up to the ceiling. And the tallest person that came in the store could not reach these shelves. But they had a sliding ladder that would go down the length of the counter, or one of the counters or whatever, or the side walls, and then they would go up the ladder and get the items that you wanted and then bring those back to the counter. And when they finished getting your list accumulated, then they would figure out the cost and tell you what it was going to be, and then take your money and give you your change. But there was no idea of, well, when you got into the bigger stores then you got into the idea that you picked up all the things that you wanted, and you could put them in a shopping bag or a tote bag that you had with you, and then bring it back to the counter where they would take it all out and then put down the cost of each item, and then put your things back in your tote bag for you, and then present you with a bill. Then this became more and more sophisticated as time went on, so that the store became larger and longer and wider, and they had more variety of things. And then they had the introduction of freezers, so that you could get frozen food, and that's practically everything that you're now familiar with by going into a grocery store, but simply not on the scale that the grocery stores are built today, and not on the scale of the variety that they had for that matter either. But you could see this transition going from a very small store to a larger and larger store. If you wanted to get meat in most of the stores, you could not, all grocery stores, you could not find a meat counter. You would have to go to a meat market in order to get your meat. So that would be a separate trip. in your shopping. And that's one of the things that it occurs to me that I witnessed in transition at some point from, say, the late 1920s and early 30s. So that's another sort of thing, and it occurs to me occasionally when I go into a store that, my, this is sure different from the way we had it when we were youngsters. Okay. I wanted to say something about hair cutting. Most of our hair salons in those days, and they didn't have too much of a speciality in hair salons for women in those days, so that if a woman wanted to get a permanent, or she wanted to have her hair cut or arranged in some way, this was done more simply. There would be a beautician in the store, and she would comb the hair and brush it, and or she would wash it and rinse it, many of the things that they do today. But if a woman wanted to get ready for a party and went to the hair salon, she wouldn't expect to pay any more than about $2 or $3 to have this done. Whereas today, if a woman or a young girl gets ready for some kind of a weekend outing, she has to pay about $50 or $60 to have her hair done. I guess that's what it is today anyway. I hear stories like that. And as far as the men getting haircuts, there were barbers in town, and the barber trade hasn't changed a great deal, except the prices have gone up considerably. We used to pay 25 cents for a haircut, and we could get this done for 15 cents or for 10 cents if we went to the right place. And I remember two young Italian men. One was about 24 years old and the other about 28 years old, and these were in separate houses. But if you went to their house, they had in their bedroom or their kitchen, they'd have a chair that was a little higher than most of the chairs, set you up on a chair, and they would give you a haircut. Now, these people probably had not taken their tests for citizenship as yet, but this is how they made their living. So by giving them 10 or 15 cents, you'd get your hair cut at their house or the rooms that they rented. That's one of the things that I remember. When I got married, which was at a pretty late age, I was still paying probably about $1 or perhaps $1.50 for a haircut. But when I knew that I had 2 children, 2 boys first, and then 4 girls, and then 2 boys, and I remember cutting their hair myself. And I didn't find this to be a very difficult task. One of the reasons why I didn't was because my older brother cut the hair in our house, and I also had an uncle who would come around who had gone through a barber school, and he would cut our hair. So we would all line up when our uncle came over to visit my father, and we would go out in front of the garage, the apron of the garage, and set up a chair out there in the summertime, and then the kids would play in the yard until it was their turn to sit on the chair and get their hair cut. So that was one of the things that happened. And when you lined up or you spoke for one of the positions, you had dibs on how soon you were going to get your hair cut, so that you'd be free of that nuisance and then get out to the neighborhood and play baseball or football or do whatever the season called for. When I cut hair in my own family, I cut the boys' hair until they were probably 17 or 18 years old. And then at that time, they had their own ideas about how they wanted their hair cut. And they worked for the money that they would use to get the haircut and relieved me of the responsibility of having to cut their hair. I also remember cutting the hair of some of the girls. forming bangs for them, and straightening out hair, bringing it over the ears just in the right way and so on, or the way Carolyn would tell me to do it. Also, I would cut Carolyn's hair occasionally too. As a matter of fact, I did this, I cut Carolyn's hair until on one occasion she said, "Ouch." That meant that the clipper got too close to her ear and she wouldn't let me cut her hair anymore. So that's what I remember about hair cutting. One of the things that I remember from, again, the age might have been 10 or 11, and that is we did not have a great deal of a trucking industry in those days, even though the trucking industry as such really became big in Akron because it was on the road, one of the more important roads from east to west. So it was halfway between New York and the Chicago area. So Akron became a kind of a midway depot, and all the big companies at that time were started in Akron, a couple of which are still going. But one of the things that I remember was the railroads were very important to us, and probably because the trucking industry hadn't made any strides about the amount of volume and that sort of thing that they transported, so that most of the transportation for industry and that sort of thing was accomplished by railroads. One of the things that they used in those days to transport circuses was the railroad industry. And they would simply load the whole circus on platforms and boxcars and put it together in the form of a train, and then schedule the stops that they made so that they could have all their workers and so on off and pitch tents and do all the things that are necessary to set up a circus program for a given area. Most of these circuses originated in the South, probably in Florida, and then you would watch the ads in the paper for the date that they would come into your community. And although my parents were not actually very interested in getting us to a circus, we were interested in seeing the animals and seeing all the activity that went on. When a circus came to town, they unloaded the trains off of Brown Street in Akron, close to Crozier. I don't know if you know where that is, but it's not too far from South Street that runs east and west in Akron. The trains would unload all the animals, the elephants. I particularly remember the elephants. The circus would have their own band, their own set of clowns, and all the personnel that you would see if you'd go into the big tent. All the dancers and the people who would swing up in the aerial part of the circus. And it was very interesting. And they would form a parade, a circus parade, up on Brown Street, and then march down to Exchange Street, and from Exchange Street they'd go into the downtown area, right in the area right now that the University of Akron uses, close to the railroad tracks. There was a wide open field there, and I think the Pennsylvania Railroad Company owned that property at the time. We would go down and watch, and they would take all these tarps out and set up these huge tents. Usually there were about 2 of them, and then a number of accompanying tents that would have animals, not a wide variety, but they would have tigers and lions and zebras. I don't remember seeing any giraffes, but some of the African animals that were popular. And then the elephants were always a special things to see. And they used the elephants to help set up the tents. They would put these harnesses on the elephants and attach ropes to them. Then they would have the large poles on the ground, and they'd have them tied together. And then the elephant they'd give him a little touch on the leg, and he'd go forward, and he'd pull all the stakes up, and suddenly the whole tent with all its canvas and everything was pretty much in place. Then they would have to put the side poles around for it, and they'd haul in bleachers which were stripped down, and they'd go inside the tent and then put all of these together, probably with nuts and bolts and that sort of thing. But it was always interesting to see these guys accomplish that. There were two movie stars at the time, movie stars who played in Western movies, and one of them that I remember his name was Hoot Gibson. And I went down to see them put up the tents there one day, and here comes Hoot Gibson right down to one of the tents, and he had a kind of a little trailer or something there that he lived in. But he'd always wave and that sort of thing. He seemed as though he was a little, I don't know, probably thinking of other things. He wasn't real friendly, but it was always kind of nice to see a movie star around sometime, and we considered these people some of our favorite folks. Okay. Well, one thing I remember, and in retrospect, I really don't see how some of these things that I did would have been permitted, like for instance in days like today. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, a lot of this stuff happened when I was old enough to adventure away from the house on my own. I always had my parents' permission, even though there was not much said about it. But I think on some occasions my mom would have been just very happy to see us out of the house for 2 or 3 hours, which would give her a little time to rest or to clean or anything, that she wanted to do. But one of the things that we did was, for interest, we would walk up to Exchange Street, and then we would walk east on Exchange to where Exchange and Market came together. Right there was a railroad track that crossed Exchange and Market, and if you stayed on this railroad track, it would take you out to the airport. I really don't remember any other way of getting there from my neighborhood, but I do remember going out to the airport on several occasions and seeing some of the sights at Akron Fulton Airport. And if you would just watch from the railroad tracks, you could see small planes come in and land, and people get into some of these small planes and then take off. They didn't have any large planes at the time, and the idea of air transportation was, it hadn't been investigated, I don't think, very much at all, but they simply weren't building large airplanes for interstate or intercountry transportation. But it was interesting to see these planes come in and take off. The Goodyear dock had been built, I think, sometime around 1927 or 28, and it was, and probably still is, one of the largest buildings that does not have any interior supports. It was always interesting to go out to and watch at the airport whenever they would take a blimp out. We did have blimps in those days, Goodyear blimps, and they would open up this massive door in front. It would come around very much like that. It was on rails and open up, and then there would be a crew, 3 or 4 men, who had ropes, and they would pull the blimp out into the open, and apparently it was ready to fly. It'd start the engines up, and then the helium on the inside would lift the blimp up in the air, and then they could maneuver just the way they do now. I don't see a great deal of noticeable difference in how they were constructed then and how they're constructed now. But one of the occasions when I went out to the airport, they were building the dirigible called the Macon. And the Macon was the largest dirigible that had ever been built. The dirigible is different from a blimp in that it has an intrastructure that's made of aluminum, I don't want to say grills, aluminum structural material. And this was formed round in the shape of the dirigible. There were catwalks after they finished the dirigible that the crewmen could get up inside of the dirigible and walk down the plank. They had anything to repair there or to check out. The crew could use those walking areas for that purpose. On this one occasion, we walked out to the airport and we saw this activity. And I guess some of the older boys had heard about or read about in the paper of their having built or being built in the hangar this tremendously huge dirigible. And so we would go from that railroad track perhaps 150 yards or 200 yards over to the hangar and then simply walk in the hangar. The part that I don't believe is how they didn't have safety people around that would shoo kids away or anybody else. So, but they apparently didn't have that kind of a safety idea. They perhaps did at the plant in order to see that nothing was stolen from the plant and taken out, or anything of any consequence being brought in. But at any rate, we were permitted to go inside this building. And I remember going in and looking up at this huge, huge object. They were working on some of the fabric that was formed, that had formed the outside of the dirigible, and they were putting some preparations on some of it, like I don't know what you'd call it now, some kind of rubberized material, and this was all silver. And when the dirigible was finished, it was one huge, huge ship that looked like it was solid silver, and it had a cab under it that was probably about 100 or 150 feet long and very wide. I think what they had in mind was developing these dirigibles so that they could use them for transportation for people and for shipping goods, like from one country to another. Because these dirigibles would actually be easy on gas, and if they took advantage of wind shifting and that sort of thing, they could go almost anywhere in the world. The Germans took the lead in building dirigibles, and they built dirigibles during World War I and used them for military purposes. They'd bring the thing up in the air, and they could look for hundreds and hundreds of yards away to see where there'd be a buildup of materials or men or anything like that. And then they did have radios in those days. They could call down, or signals from the ship, and call down artillery fire on opportunity targets. But the Germans were very successful, and one of their aircraft was called the Graf Zeppelin. And the Graf Zeppelin visited the United States on probably 3 or 4 occasions. And on one of the occasions, one of the 2 occasions, they came to Akron, because Akron had the big hangar, and they would put down in Akron and stay there for a while. You could go out to the airport and see the ship. But when it came in on this one occasion, it flew right over my house. I looked out my bedroom window, and here's this big silver thing, and passing and passing and passing, and that was a beautiful, beautiful ship. So that's what I'm going to tell you about dirigibles. The first large dirigible that was built in Akron was called the Akron. And these ships were, by and large, they were made for the Navy. The Navy could order them and have them built, and most of the dirigibles in those days were built in Akron. The Germans also continued to build dirigibles, and one of the largest that they had built was the Hindenburg. And the Hindenburg, I think it was on its first voyage from Germany to the United States, it landed at Lakehurst, New Jersey. And when it came down, there are pictures of it in old news captions that they have. And when it came down, some of the sailors from Lakehurst were pulling on ropes to bring it down. And they got about probably 200 feet, down to 200 feet in the air, and suddenly the back end of it caught fire, and then it destroyed the whole ship. This was one of the reasons why people stopped making dirigibles. The Germans had nothing but natural gas to give the ship lift. In the United States, from the mines in Texas, was the only place where you could get helium. So the American ships were using helium, which was non-flammable, and the Germans had the flammable material at that time. So their ships were more at the mercy of very careful kinds of care that they would have in flying their ship. When I was in among the gang there, when you're a teenager, and Joe, you could probably vouch for me on this, a lot of times you don't say anything or make any contribution to conversation because you're afraid you're going to say something wrong, or you're not going to express yourself well. And I was always conscious of that. So consequently, I didn't do a lot of talking when I was with people. And the way it came out with a lot of people was they thought I was smart. I didn't think I was smart, but they thought I was smart because I wouldn't say anything stupid. And then one time, it was, I guess we were overseas at the time, some guy asked me, he says, "Hey, Cook," he says, "how come you never say anything?" And I said, "Well," I said, "if I do say something, you want to pay close attention because I've really got something to say." And I think that was a good thing to say at the time.
That was probably the first cussing you heard too from there.
Well, no, I was used to cussing.
He was in the rubber factory for a while,
The
right?
rubber factory.
So you graduated from high school, worked in the rubber factory for 1 year, and then we're going off to college?
Yeah, that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
I had 2 jobs before I got the job at Firestone. And I couldn't have got it any earlier than that, age-wise, because they just wouldn't hire you if you were a teenager. And we were just getting to a point in 1942 where we would have all these factory jobs filled, see? And they were doing a lot of hiring when they put me into the steel plant. What I was doing in there was I was making rings for truck wheels. They'd have a rim, and the rim would have a kind of a pit around it, and when they put the tire and the tube, they had tubes and tires in those days, they didn't have tubeless. You'd put the tube and the tire rim on, and then you would take this ring, and it would have to be pressed on with some machine or banged on with a hammer or mallet or something like that. Then that would hold the tire and the tube into place, and then you'd inflate the tube. You would not inflate the tire. So that's what I was making, those rings.
Mm-hmm.
That was another story there too. One time, what I did was there was a trough close to where I worked, and I worked on a sawing machine. the blade was about that long, and the machine was in motion almost all the time. And I could get it out of motion by just getting it and then bringing it down into place just by muscle pressure. But this trough would send down a coil of this metal. Then I would take the coil and put it, have to dodge the machine, but I'd put it on this machine, and there was a means of pushing it together and locking it in place so that the saw could go through this coil, and then the coil would end up being rings. So that was my job, to cut those coils. And then I would take, after that was done, I would unloosen the things that held the coil in place, pull the rings off, put them down another chute, and some guy down at the end of this chute would take them out one at a time and put them in an electric welding machine, stick the ends together, and they'd be welded. So. Oh, and then I said that to say, this guy that coiled this coil, he got long, oh, it was a piece of metal probably from here to the wall of the house over there, and he would stick that in a machine that had 3 wheels on it. You'd stick it in, and then it would make it go around in a circle, and pretty soon you'd have this coil that would come down the chute there for me. But he had his hand up in one of these rings one time and cut those 3 fingers right off.
Oh,
Boy,
man.
awful. He was so scared.
That'd be bad. You must have known after a year of that you didn't want to continue doing that.
And
for
somebody
the rest of your life.
almost got killed on this machine I was on too while I was there. But you'd have to be aware of this thing coming at you, and it's a big, heavy piece of metal. And when you if you put a new blade in, I'd have to stop the machine, and then you open up the front of it, which is very much like a hacksaw.